171 years ago, in a remote plantation chapel in rural Mississippi, 24 enslaved children vanished from all official records within a single year. Church ledgers, burned and partially reconstructed decades later, revealed cryptic annotations beside their names: transferred, relocated, departed. But no destination was ever listed. No sale receipts existed. No correspondence mentioned their whereabouts. In 2019, a graduate student researching antebellum religious practices stumbled upon a faded daguerreotype dated 1854. 24 children standing in front of a modest wooden chapel, their faces solemn, their eyes revealing something the photographer couldn't capture: fear. On the back, a single line written in careful script: "The chapel's children. May God forgive us." The discovery triggered an investigation that would unearth one of the most disturbing secrets of American slavery: a systematic program hidden behind religious instruction, where children disappeared into silence, and only 2 survived to tell a story that the world refused to hear for more than a century. What happened inside that chapel? Why were these children chosen? And what truth was so unspeakable that an entire community conspired to bury it forever? This is the story of silence, complicity, and the persistent voices of the forgotten who refused to stay buried. Chapter 1. The photograph that broke the silence. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. 171 years ago, in an isolated plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, military documents and local records mentioned a case so disturbing it ended up buried in silence. 24 enslaved children disappeared from official records, but not from the oral memory of the community. The absence left deep scars, marking generations with a silent trauma that only now begins to be revealed. Dr. Sarah Chen never intended to become a forensic historian. Her dissertation focused on religious education in antebellum South, dry academic work that seemed safely distant from the raw wounds of slavery's brutality. But on a humid afternoon in July 2019, while cataloging photographs in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, she found something that would consume the next 6 years of her life. The daguerreotype was stored in an unmarked box, wedged between plantation inventories and cotton trade records. The image showed 24 children, ages appearing to range from 6 to 14, standing in 3 neat rows before a simple wooden structure. Their clothing was uniform: plain grey smocks for the girls, rough cotton shirts for the boys. What struck Chen immediately was their expressions. Unlike typical plantation photographs, where enslaved people were often positioned as background figures or displayed in dehumanizing poses, these children stared directly at the camera with an intensity that transcended time. The chapel behind them was modest, barely more than a large cabin with a crude cross mounted above the door, but it was the inscription on the photograph's reverse that made Chen's hands tremble: "The chapel's children. May God forgive us. Reverend J.M., April 1854. Adore Chen spent 3 weeks trying to identify the location. The architectural style suggested central Mississippi. The clothing matched descriptions from Wilkinson County plantations, but no chapel matching the photograph's description appeared in any historical survey she could find. It was as if the building had been erased from existence. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Marlene Washington, an elderly resident of Woodville, Mississippi, attended one of Chen's public lectures about plantation architecture. After the presentation, Washington approached with a weathered leather journal that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother, formerly enslaved on the Hartwell plantation. "My grandmother said we weren't supposed to talk about the chapel," Washington explained, her voice barely above a whisper. She said those who spoke of it brought misfortune to their families. But I'm 83 years old now. If not me, then who? The journal, written in careful, educated script, belonged to a woman named Rachel, one of only 2 survivors of whatever happened at the chapel. The first entry Chen read made her blood run cold. They took us from our mothers on the first day of spring, 24 of us, chosen for our quick minds and strong bodies. Reverend Morrison said we were blessed, selected for a higher purpose. They told our families we would receive religious instruction, that we would return as teachers for the others. My mother believed them. She wept with gratitude as they led me away. I never saw her again. None of us did. Chen immediately contacted her department chair. Within 48 hours, she had assembled a team, a forensic anthropologist, a legal historian specializing in plantation records, and a genealogist who had spent decades tracing families torn apart by slavery. The investigation began with the Hartwell plantation records, still maintained by descendants who had converted the property into a historical site. The plantation ledgers were meticulous. Every pound of cotton, every tool, every enslaved person carefully documented. But April 1854 showed an anomaly. 24 children, ages 6 to 14, were transferred from the main quarters to a separate location listed only as the chapel residence. No further entries appeared for any of them in the main ledger. However, a separate, partially burned ledger was discovered in 2020 during renovation work on the property's old overseer's house. The pages were brittle, many sections illegible from fire damage. But what remained was damning. Beside each child's name appeared a series of cryptic notations, medical observations, behavioral assessments, and dates. 22 of the 24 entries ended with a single word that appeared again and again: expired. Only 2 names lacked this final notation: Rachel Washington and Thomas Freeman. Beside their names, in different handwriting, someone had written, "Transferred North, 1855." Dr. Marcus Reed, the team's forensic anthropologist, began the grim work of searching the property. Plantation records indicated the chapel had stood approximately 1 mile from the main house, in a clearing near a spring. The structure itself had burned in 1856, according to a brief mention in county records. No investigation into the fire was ever recorded. Using ground-penetrating radar, Reed's team discovered something that confirmed their darkest suspicions. 30 feet behind, where the chapel once stood, the radar showed anomalies consistent with a mass burial site. The soil density patterns suggested multiple interments, some overlapping, all shallow. The excavation began in March 2021. What they found would force historians to confront one of slavery's most hidden horrors. Not just the violence inflicted on enslaved people, but the systematic experiments conducted on children in the name of science and profit. The first skeletal remains they uncovered belonged to a child no older than 8. The bones showed signs of malnutrition and disease. But it was what surrounded the remains that made the team pause. Medical instruments, glass vials, and fragments of a leather journal containing detailed medical observations. 23 sets of remains would eventually be recovered. Each told a story of suffering that had been deliberately erased from history. Chapter 2. The Reverend's Divine Commission. Reverend Jonathan Morrison arrived at the Hartwell plantation in January 1853 with impeccable credentials and a divine commission that would doom 24 children to a fate worse than the brutality most enslaved people endured. Educated at Princeton Theological Seminary, Morrison had published several papers on what he termed moral education of the African race. His writings, typical of the era's pseudo-scientific racism, argued that enslavement could be a tool for spiritual and intellectual elevation if properly administered under Christian guidance. Plantation owners across the South celebrated his work. Here was a man of God who provided theological justification for their wealth and power. But Morrison's true interest lay elsewhere. In his personal correspondence, recently discovered in Princeton's archives, he revealed an obsession that went far beyond religious instruction. He believed enslaved children represented ideal subjects for experimental education because, as he wrote, their minds remain uncontaminated by the degraded habits of their parents, malleable clay for a sculptor's hand. Colonel James Hartwell, owner of one of Mississippi's largest cotton plantations, invited Morrison to establish what they publicly called a religious training institute for enslaved children. The project received funding from 3 neighboring plantation owners and quiet endorsement from the county's medical society. The stated goal was to create a model program that could be replicated across the South, proof that slavery could be civilized and humane. The reality was far darker. Morrison's journal, partially preserved in the burned ledger, reveals the true nature of the chapel program. The children weren't selected randomly. Morrison specifically requested those who showed particular intelligence, physical health, and, disturbingly, specific physical characteristics. The selection criteria matched those used in breeding programs, a horrifying realization that took Chen's team months to fully comprehend. The program Morrison designed combined religious indoctrination with what he called scientific observation. The children were isolated from their families, housed in a dormitory attached to the chapel, and subjected to a rigid schedule that began before dawn and ended after sunset. But the religious instruction was merely a cover. Morrison had obtained medical equipment through his connections with physicians in New Orleans and Charleston. His correspondence reveals purchases of instruments typically used in anatomy studies, along with various tonics, compounds, and substances whose purposes remained vague in his carefully coded letters. He referred to the children not by name, but by number, recording their progress in clinical terms that stripped them of humanity. Rachel's journal provides the children's perspective, a counter-narrative that exposes Morrison's careful documentation as the record of systematic abuse. He called it instruction, but it was torture dressed in scripture. We stood for hours reciting verses while he observed us with instruments, measuring our heads, examining our teeth like we were livestock. The younger ones cried. He said crying was evidence of weak moral character and made them stand longer. When Mary collapsed from exhaustion, he didn't call for help. He simply recorded the time and her symptoms in his book. The program quickly escalated beyond observation. Morrison began administering various compounds to the children, recording their effects with scientific detachment. His notes describe symptoms consistent with mercury poisoning, ergot toxicity, and other ailments caused by experimental medications. When children became ill, and they frequently did, Morrison documented their decline with clinical precision, but provided minimal care. The plantation owners remained willfully ignorant. They visited the chapel quarterly, saw clean, orderly children reciting scripture, and congratulated themselves on their enlightened approach to slavery. Morrison presented carefully staged demonstrations of the children's progress, showing how they could read Bible passages, perform mathematical calculations, and discuss theological concepts. What the visitors never saw were the nighttime experiments, the sick children hidden in back rooms, or the small graves accumulating behind the chapel. Colonel Hartwell's own correspondence, preserved in his Descendants collection, reveals his awareness that something was wrong. In a letter to his brother dated November 1854, he wrote, "Morrison's program continues, though I confess unease at the number of children who have taken ill. He assures me these losses are necessary for the greater advancement of his methods. I try to maintain faith in his expertise, though my conscience troubles me." Yet Hartwell did nothing. None of the plantation owners did. They had invested money and reputation in Morrison's program. To acknowledge its true nature would mean confronting their own complicity in something far worse than the routine cruelties of slavery. So they chose silence, and 24 children paid the price. By early 1855, only Rachel and Thomas remained alive. The others had expired from various ailments that Morrison recorded with cold precision. Subject 7. Pulmonary failure following administration of compound B. Subject 12. Seizures and death after 3 days of treatment, C. Subject 18. Complete organ failure, cause uncertain. Morrison's journal ends abruptly in March 1855. His final entry reads, "The work cannot continue. Opposition grows. The children's knowledge makes them dangerous. Transfer arrangements made for subjects 1 and 15. All materials to be secured." 3 weeks later, Morrison left Mississippi. He returned to New Jersey, resumed his academic career, and published a well-received book on religious education that made no mention of his Mississippi experiment. He died in 1879, honored as a progressive thinker and humanitarian. The chapel burned in 1856. The fire was officially ruled accidental, though no investigation was conducted. All of Morrison's equipment and records stored there were destroyed, or so everyone believed. Chapter 3. The Children Who Vanished. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Understanding who the children were requires piecing together fragments, plantation ledgers that listed them as property, oral histories passed down through generations, and Rachel's journal, which preserved their names when all official records tried to erase them. The children came from 6 different plantations in Wilkinson County. Morrison's selection criteria was specific and disturbing. He requested children between 6 and 14 who demonstrated exceptional aptitude, those who had taught themselves to read despite prohibitions, who showed mathematical ability when counting supplies, or who displayed what overseers called unusual intelligence. These were children whose potential threatened the system's fundamental premise that enslaved people were intellectually inferior. Sarah, age 13, was the oldest. Plantation records show she had been teaching younger children in secret, using stolen paper and charcoal to write lessons by moonlight. When Morrison heard of her abilities, he insisted on her inclusion. Her mother, according to oral histories, begged Colonel Hartwell to refuse. He told her Sarah was being given an opportunity, a chance for education that most enslaved people never received. Sarah's mother never saw her daughter again. The youngest was a boy named Daniel, only 6 years old. He had memorized entire conversations after hearing them once, a gift that made overseers nervous. Morrison called him Subject 24 and wrote extensively about Daniel's memory capacity. The child appears in Morrison's notes more than any other, and his suffering was documented with particularly cold precision. Daniel died in August 1854, 5 months after entering the program. Cause of death, according to Morrison's clinical notes: complete collapse following extended observation period. Subject proved unable to sustain mental acuity under continued stimulation. Rachel's journal provides translations for Morrison's euphemisms. Daniel was kept awake for days at a time, while Morrison tested his memory limits. The child was given substances that kept him alert, but caused severe distress. When he finally collapsed, Morrison recorded his death as a scientific observation, not a tragedy he had caused. Thomas Freeman, the other survivor, was 12 when selected. Unlike the others, Thomas had been born on the Hartwell plantation and had grown up alongside the colonel's own children. He had learned to read by watching the plantation tutor through windows. Morrison selected him specifically because of this background, believing Thomas represented what he called the highest potential of the African intellect under benevolent white guidance. Thomas's connection to the Hartwell family would ultimately save him and Rachel. When the deaths began accumulating, Thomas managed to get a message to Hartwell's youngest son, Edward, who had been Thomas's childhood playmate. Edward's intervention, recorded in his own diary, found during the 2020 document discovery, forced his father to finally investigate. "I went to the chapel against father's orders," Edward wrote. "What I saw there haunts me still. Children thin as skeletons, some so weak they could barely stand. Thomas begged me to help them. I ran to father and demanded he stop whatever Morrison was doing. Father was angry at first, accused me of interfering with important work. But when I described what I'd seen, something in his expression changed. He realized, I think, that he had allowed evil to flourish under the guise of education." But Edward's intervention came too late for 22 children. By the time Colonel Hartwell visited the chapel himself in February 1855, only Rachel and Thomas remained alive. The others had been buried quietly behind the chapel, their deaths unreported to any authority. Their families told only that they had been transferred to other plantations or had died of natural ailments. Chen's team spent months identifying the children through a combination of plantation records, genealogical research, and DNA analysis of the remains. Many modern African-American families in Wilkinson County carry genetic links to the chapel children, cousins, great-nieces, and nephews who never knew their relatives had been part of this program. The identification process revealed another layer of tragedy. Several families had oral histories about ancestors who disappeared in the 1850s. These stories, passed down through generations, spoke of children taken for special training who never returned. The families had been told these children had been sold south, the most feared fate for enslaved people. Learning the truth, that they had died in medical experiments less than a mile from their families, was both a revelation and a reopening of century-old wounds. Marcus Johnson, a retired postal worker from Woodville, learned in 2022 that his great-great-great-grandmother was Sarah, the 13-year-old who had taught others to read. "We always knew she was special," Johnson said during an interview with Chen's team. "Family stories said she was brilliant, that she could have been anything if she'd been born free. We thought she'd been sold away and died somewhere in Louisiana. Finding out what really happened, it's like losing her all over again." The children's names deserve to be remembered. Sarah, Daniel, Thomas, Rachel, Mary, James, Elizabeth, Samuel, Hannah, Jacob, Martha, Isaac, Rebecca, Moses, Ruth, Benjamin, Lydia, Joshua, Miriam, Aaron, Deborah, Caleb, Naomi, and Ezra. 24 souls, whose potential was stolen, whose suffering was hidden, whose deaths were recorded only in a madman's clinical journal. Morrison chose them because they were exceptional. The system destroyed them for the same reason. Chapter 4. Behind Closed Doors. The experiment revealed. The full scope of Morrison's program remained hidden until Chen's team completed their analysis of the burned ledger and cross-referenced it with medical journals from the 1850s. What emerged was a portrait of systematic abuse disguised as scientific inquiry and religious education. Morrison's correspondence with physicians in Charleston and New Orleans reveals his true intentions. He was attempting to prove several interconnected theories popular among slavery's intellectual defenders. That African Americans possessed fundamentally different physiological responses to disease and medication, that their pain tolerance was higher, and that their intellectual capacity could be measured and improved through controlled interventions. These theories weren't fringe beliefs. They were taught at respected medical schools and published in scientific journals. Physicians across the South conducted experiments on enslaved people without consent, justifying their actions as necessary for medical advancement. Morrison's program represented an extreme application of this mindset, focused specifically on children. The daily routine at the chapel followed a pattern designed to maximize Morrison's observation opportunities while maintaining the appearance of religious instruction. Children woke at 4:30 in the morning for prayers. Breakfast consisted of cornmeal mush and water. Then began what Morrison called educational exercises. Hours of forced recitation, mathematics problems, and theological study designed to exhaust the children mentally. But interspersed throughout the day were what Morrison termed scientific observations. He measured the children's physical responses to various stimuli, how long they could stand without moving, how they reacted to sudden noises, how quickly they could perform mental calculations under stress. He recorded their vital signs obsessively, checking pulses, temperatures, and breathing rates multiple times daily. The most disturbing aspect of Morrison's program involved experimental medications. His correspondence mentions acquiring various compounds, mercury-based tonics supposedly to strengthen the blood, opioid derivatives to calm nervous dispositions, and various other substances whose purposes he deliberately obscured in his letters. He administered these to the children in different doses, recording their effects with clinical detachment. Rachel's journal provides the children's experience of these experiments. He called it medicine, but we knew it was poison. The tonics made us dizzy, made our stomachs ache. Some children vomited blood. The little ones cried and begged not to take the medicine, but he forced it down their throats, saying it was for our betterment. When Hannah started having seizures after the blue liquid, he just watched her and wrote in his book. He didn't try to help. He measured how long the seizures lasted. Modern medical analysis of Morrison's notes reveals he was conducting dose-response experiments, deliberately increasing amounts of toxic substances to observe their effects. This kind of experimentation was practiced on enslaved people across the South, but Morrison's focus on children and the systematic nature of his program makes it particularly heinous. The physical environment contributed to the children's deterioration. The chapel dormitory was unheated in winter and poorly ventilated in summer. Morrison believed that environmental hardship would strengthen moral character. Children slept on thin pallets on wooden floors. Food was deliberately kept minimal. Morrison claimed this prevented laziness and sloth. In reality, he was studying the effects of malnutrition on cognitive function. When children became ill from his experiments, Morrison provided minimal care. His journal entries describe symptoms clearly indicating severe poisoning. Subject 9 experiencing tremors, excessive salivation, confusion, mental acuity declining. Continue observation. There's no indication he attempted to help the child recover. The boy died 3 days later. The psychological torture matched the physical abuse. Morrison isolated children who showed signs of rebellion or tried to help others. He used religion as a weapon, telling sick children their suffering was divine punishment for sins. He forced them to watch as other children deteriorated and died, claiming these deaths were God's will, and warning them that questioning his methods was questioning God. Rachel's journal reveals an even darker truth. Morrison specifically targeted children who tried to protect others. When Thomas tried to give extra food to younger children, Morrison punished him by forcing him to watch Daniel's final days without intervening. When Sarah tried to comfort a dying child, Morrison isolated her for days in complete darkness. He wanted to break us, Rachel wrote, not just our bodies, our spirits. He wanted to prove we were animals that could be trained through cruelty. But even as children died around us, even as we suffered things I still can't fully describe, we never stopped being human. We whispered stories to each other at night. We sang quietly when he was away. We held each other when the pain was too much. He couldn't take that from us. The plantation owner's occasional visits show how easily atrocities can be hidden in plain sight. Morrison prepared for these inspections days in advance. He selected the healthiest children to demonstrate progress. Sick children were hidden in back rooms or told to stay silent on threat of punishment. He staged elaborate religious services where children recited scripture flawlessly, demonstrating their advancement. Colonel Hartwell and the other owners saw what they wanted to see: clean, educated children who appeared to be thriving under enlightened instruction. They never asked where the other children were. They never questioned why the initial group of 24 had dwindled. When Morrison explained that some had been transferred to other plantations or had succumbed to natural illness, they accepted these explanations without investigation. This willful blindness was itself a form of complicity. The owners knew that enslaved children had high mortality rates under normal circumstances. In their minds, losing a few children to illness was unfortunate, but expected. They didn't want to look closely enough to see that these weren't natural deaths. They were murders disguised as medical research. Chapter 5. The Weight of Silence. By November 1854, Morrison's program was collapsing. 15 children had died in 8 months. The rate of deaths was becoming impossible to conceal, even from plantation owners who preferred ignorance. But what finally threatened to expose the program wasn't moral conscience. It was economics and fear of scandal. Colonel Hartwell's ledgers from late 1854 show a growing concern about financial losses. Each child represented a significant investment, not just in their current value as enslaved labor, but in their potential future worth. Enslaved children were seen as long-term assets that would produce decades of labor, and in the case of girls, more enslaved people through reproduction. The deaths of 15 children represented thousands of dollars in lost capital. More concerning to Hartwell was the risk of scandal. Mississippi in 1854 was engaged in fierce political debates about slavery's future. Abolitionists in the North were gaining ground, and Southern defenders of slavery relied heavily on arguments that enslavement was actually beneficial for African Americans, a civilizing influence that improved their lives. Morrison's program was supposed to provide evidence for these claims. Instead, it had become a mass death site that, if exposed, could fuel abolitionist arguments. Hartwell's correspondence with his fellow investors shows increasing alarm. In a letter dated November 12, 1854, he wrote, "Morrison assures me the recent losses are necessary sacrifices for scientific advancement. But I fear the numbers are too great to explain satisfactorily should inquiries arise. We must consider how to proceed with minimal exposure." The phrase minimal exposure reveals everything. Hartwell wasn't concerned about the children suffering. He was concerned about protecting his reputation and investment. His solution wasn't to shut down the program and help the surviving children. It was to find a way to hide what had happened. The answer came from an unexpected source: Dr. Benjamin Whitmore, a physician from New Orleans who had supplied Morrison with some of the experimental compounds. Whitmore had connections with northern charitable organizations that claimed to rescue enslaved children by purchasing their freedom and placing them in educational institutions. In reality, these organizations often exploited the children they claimed to help, but they provided useful cover. Whitmore suggested that the surviving children could be transferred north through one of these organizations. This would remove the witnesses while allowing the plantation owners to claim they had generously freed exceptional students. Morrison's records would be kept secure, and the program could be quietly closed without public explanation. This solution satisfied everyone except the people who mattered most: the families of the dead children and the survivors themselves. The families had been kept systematically uninformed. When their children died, they weren't told immediately. Morrison would wait weeks or sometimes months before informing parents. claiming the child had been transferred to another plantation for advanced training. By the time families learned the truth, their children were already buried in unmarked graves behind the chapel. Rachel's journal describes the moment she learned what had happened to the others. "I asked Morrison where Mary was. She had been coughing blood for days and then suddenly disappeared from the dormitory. He looked at me with those cold eyes and said, 'Mary has gone to her eternal rest. You would do well to ensure your own moral character doesn't lead you to the same fate.' That's when I understood. They weren't being transferred, they were dying, and he was killing them, and no one was stopping him, because no one cared enough to ask questions." Thomas, in his later testimony, described the psychological torture of watching children disappear one by one. "We knew what was happening," he said, "but we were children. Enslaved children without any power. We couldn't run. Where would we go? We couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe us? We could only endure and pray that we would somehow survive." The community's silence extended beyond the plantation. Enslaved people throughout Wilkinson County knew something terrible was happening at the chapel. Information traveled through the invisible networks that connected enslaved communities. Whispered conversations, coded songs, warnings passed through work gangs. But speaking openly about the chapel was dangerous. Overseers punished anyone who spread rumors about plantation business. Several enslaved people were whipped for discussing the children's deaths. Even more disturbing was the complicity of local authorities. Dr. James Patterson, Wilkinson County's medical examiner, had to have known about the unusual death rate among children at the Hartwell plantation, but no official investigation was ever initiated. Patterson's personal papers, discovered during Chen's research, reveal why. He and Morrison corresponded regularly, discussing medical theories and experimental approaches. Patterson saw Morrison's work as scientifically valuable and actively helped conceal it. In a letter dated December 1854, Patterson wrote to Morrison, "I understand your concerns about excessive mortality rates attracting unwanted attention. I have adjusted the county health records to distribute the deaths across several plantations and various common ailments. This should prevent any pattern from emerging that might trigger investigation. This was a deliberate conspiracy to hide mass death." Patterson's falsified records meant that even if abolitionists or concerned citizens tried to investigate, they would find no evidence of unusual mortality at the Hartwell Chapel. The local church community also failed the children. Reverend Morrison preached regularly at Woodville's First Presbyterian Church. He was respected, admired for his dedication to uplifting the enslaved through Christian education. When he requested donations for his mission work, the congregation generously contributed. No one asked difficult questions. No one visited the chapel unannounced to see conditions firsthand. This network of silence, from plantation owners protecting investments, to medical professionals falsifying records, to religious communities choosing comfortable illusions over uncomfortable truths, created a perfect environment for atrocities to continue undetected. By early 1855, that silence was beginning to fracture. Edward Hartwell's discovery and his insistence that his father investigate forced a reckoning. But even then, the response wasn't justice, it was damage control. Chapter 6. Two Who Survived. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of the chapel's children reach more people. Rachel Washington and Thomas Freeman survived what 22 other children did not. But survival came with burdens they would carry for the rest of their lives. Understanding how they escaped requires examining both luck and the complicated dynamics of power within the slavery system. Thomas's survival was directly tied to his relationship with Edward Hartwell. The bond between them, formed in childhood before the rigid racial hierarchies fully separated them, created a crack in the system of silence. When Thomas managed to slip Edward a note describing conditions at the chapel in January 1855, Edward's response broke the pattern of willful ignorance that had allowed Morrison to operate unchecked. Edward's diary entry from that day provides rare insight into how an enslaved person could leverage personal relationships to survival. Thomas gave me a note as I rode past the chapel path. I should not have stopped. Father forbids fraternization with the enslaved. But Thomas and I played together as children, and some bonds resist the cruelty of the system that created them. The note was brief but horrifying. "They are dying. Please help us before we all die." I confronted Father that evening. His anger turned to shock when I described what I had seen at the chapel. For the first time, I saw him recognize his own complicity. Colonel Hartwell's response was immediate but limited. He ordered Morrison to cease all experimental treatments and summoned Dr. Patterson to examine the surviving children. Patterson's examination report, preserved in the burned ledger's remains, is a masterpiece of medical euphemism. He noted that Rachel and Thomas showed signs of general debilitation from rigorous educational requirements, and recommended restoration through rest and proper nutrition. No mention of poisoning, no acknowledgement of abuse. Patterson was protecting Morrison, and by extension, himself and the entire conspiracy of silence. But Colonel Hartwell had made a decision. The program would end, not because it was morally wrong, but because it had become a liability. Morrison would leave Mississippi, the surviving children would be relocated, the dead would remain buried in their unmarked graves, and everyone involved would maintain absolute silence. Rachel and Thomas were separated in February 1855. Rachel was sold, though the transaction was disguised as a charitable transfer, to a Quaker family in Philadelphia through Dr. Whitmore's northern connections. She was 15 years old, one of only 2 survivors of a program that had consumed 24 children. Thomas remained at the Hartwell plantation for several more months before being freed through Edward Hartwell's personal intervention. Edward, guilt-stricken by what he had discovered too late, convinced his father to free Thomas on his 18th birthday. Colonel Hartwell agreed, partly from guilt and partly to secure Thomas's silence. The implicit threat was clear: freedom in exchange for never speaking of what happened at the chapel. Both Rachel and Thomas violated that silence eventually, but not until decades later, when they believed they could speak safely. Rachel's life in Philadelphia was complex. The Quaker family that took her in genuinely opposed slavery and treated her kindly, but they also didn't fully comprehend the trauma she carried. Her journal entries from 1855-1860 reveal someone struggling to process what she had endured while adapting to an entirely new world. They are kind here. They mean well. But when they speak of slavery as an abstract moral evil, I want to scream. I know its exact weight, its precise texture, its specific taste. I survived something most people cannot imagine. And I cannot speak of it because no one wants to hear details that disturb their comfortable opposition to slavery. They want simple narratives of suffering and redemption. They don't want to hear about children dying slowly while a minister recorded their agony for science. Rachel learned to read and write fluently during her years in Philadelphia. She attended school, worked as a seamstress, and eventually married a freeman named John Washington in 1862. She had 4 children, none of whom she told about the chapel until much later in life. The trauma was too raw, the memories too painful. Thomas's path was different. After gaining his freedom in 1856, he headed west, eventually settling in Kansas during the post-Civil War migration of freed people. He learned carpentry, built a small homestead, and married a woman named Sarah, not the Sarah from the chapel. Thomas chose a wife with the same name as his friend who had died, a way of honoring her memory. Thomas rarely spoke of his past. His children knew he had been enslaved in Mississippi, but knew little else. He developed a reputation in his community as someone who worked obsessively, as if trying to outrun something. Neighbors noted that he never attended church services despite being deeply spiritual at home. The association between religion and Morrison's abuse had permanently damaged his relationship with organized Christianity. The two survivors maintained no contact with each other. They had no way to find one another in a country of millions. And both were trying to build new lives far from Mississippi. But they each independently did something remarkable. They kept records. Rachel's journal continued for 53 years, ending in 1908, shortly before her death. It provided a day-by-day account of her life after the chapel, but also detailed memories of what happened there, written down as if creating testimony for a trial she knew would never occur in her lifetime. Thomas could write only basically, but he dictated his memories to his daughter, Margaret, in the 1890s. Margaret later typed these dictations and preserved them, along with a note. "My father asked me to keep this record safe. He said someday people would need to know what was done to enslaved children in the name of science and God." Both survivors dealt with what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. Rachel's journal describes nightmares that persisted for decades, panic attacks triggered by certain smells or sounds, and periods of deep depression. Thomas, according to family accounts, would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares about children crying for help he couldn't provide. Neither lived to see their testimonies validated by historical research. Rachel died in 1910 at age 70. Thomas died in 1905 at 63. They went to their graves, believing their story would remain one more secret buried in slavery's vast graveyard of unacknowledged crimes. They were wrong. But the validation came 109 years too late for Rachel and 114 years too late for Thomas. Chapter 7. The Fire That Buried Everything. In May 1856, 14 months after the program ended, the chapel burned to the ground. The fire occurred on a Tuesday night, during a period when no activities were scheduled at the building. By the time enslaved people working nearby noticed the flames, the structure was fully engulfed. Nothing survived. The official investigation, documented in Wilkinson County records, consisted of a single page. Fire Marshal Thomas Beckworth concluded that the blaze was accidental in origin, likely caused by an improperly extinguished lamp. The investigation took less than a day. No witnesses were formally interviewed. No evidence was preserved. The site was cleared and plowed under within a week. The speed and thoroughness of the response suggests that the fire wasn't accidental. It was the final step in erasing the chapel program from history. Chen's team found evidence of this cover-up in multiple sources. Colonel Hartwell's personal correspondence from May 1856 contains a cryptic letter to his brother. "The matter we discussed has been permanently resolved. The site is cleared. We may now move forward without concern for past entanglements." Dr. Patterson's papers include a memo to the county commission recommending against any further investigation into the chapel fire, noting that the structure served its purpose and its loss represents no significant concern to the community. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. In 2023, Chen's team located a descendant of Samuel Curtis, an enslaved person who worked as a blacksmith on the Hartwell plantation in 1856. Family oral history, passed down through 5 generations, told a specific story. Samuel had been ordered to scatter lamp oil throughout the chapel interior 3 days before the fire. He was told this was to clean and preserve the wood. 3 days later, the building burned. Samuel never told this story publicly. Doing so would have endangered his life and his family. But he told his children, who told their children, preserving the truth through the same oral traditions that sustained so many truths that official history tried to erase. The fire destroyed Morrison's medical equipment. his detailed journals of the experiments, and any physical evidence of what had occurred inside the chapel. The mass grave behind the building was ploughed over, and the area was planted with cotton. Within a year, no visible trace remained that the chapel had ever existed. But fires don't destroy everything. The partially burned ledger survived because it had been stored in the overseer's house, not the chapel itself. Morrison's correspondence survived because his letters remained in the recipient's collections. Rachel's and Thomas's journals survived because they kept them hidden and their descendants preserved them. And the memories survived, passed down through generations of families who knew their ancestors had disappeared into silence. Chen's team also discovered that Morrison attempted to restart his program in Louisiana in 1857. He approached several plantation owners with proposals for similar educational institutes. But word had spread through the plantation owner networks about the high death rate in Mississippi. Morrison's reputation, once sterling, was now quietly suspect. No one would fund a second program. Morrison eventually returned to New Jersey and shifted his focus to theoretical writing about race and education. His published works from 1858 to 1879 contain no mention of his Mississippi experiment. He presented himself as a theorist, not a practitioner, a man of ideas, rather than a man who had killed children in the name of those ideas. After Morrison's death in 1879, his papers were donated to Princeton. The university archived them as part of their historical collections, unaware of what they documented. Chen discovered them in 2020 during a systematic search of theological archives. Reading Morrison's careful, clinical descriptions of children dying from his experiments while sitting in a quiet academic library was, Chen later said, one of the most disturbing experiences of her career. He wrote about these children the way someone might write about laboratory rats, Chen explained in a 2022 interview. There was no recognition of their humanity, no acknowledgement that he was causing suffering and death, and Princeton honored him as a distinguished alumnus. His name appears on donor lists. Until we revealed what we'd found, he was remembered as a progressive educator. That's how thoroughly the cover-up succeeded. The university has since removed Morrison's name from its honors and added contextual materials to his archived papers explaining his crimes. But for more than 140 years, a child murderer was celebrated as a humanitarian. Another victory for the conspiracy of silence. The chapel site itself remained hidden until Chen's team used ground-penetrating radar in 2021. The area had been agricultural land for over a century. Current property owners had no idea what lay beneath their fields. When the team informed them of the discovery and requested permission to excavate, the landowners, descendants of people who had owned enslaved people in the 1850s, faced a difficult choice: allow the truth to emerge or maintain the silence their ancestors had created. To their credit, they chose truth. The excavation that began in March 2021 would eventually uncover 23 sets of remains, all children, all showing signs of malnutrition and poisoning, all buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Subject 24. Daniel, the 6-year-old with the extraordinary memory, was never found. His remains are still missing, possibly buried elsewhere or destroyed in some way that left no trace. The excavation drew protests from some community members who argued that the past should stay buried, that exposing these horrors served no purpose except to divide communities and create pain. One local resident wrote in a letter to the editor of the Woodville Republican, "These events happened 170 years ago. Everyone involved is long dead. Digging up these bones and these stories only causes trouble. Let the dead rest." But for descendants of the chapel children, the excavation represented long-delayed justice. Marcus Johnson, descendant of Sarah, spoke at the site during the excavation. "My ancestor couldn't rest because her story was buried with her. Now that story is told. Now she can rest." Truth doesn't divide communities. Lies divide communities. Truth allows healing. The physical evidence from the excavation confirmed everything Rachel and Thomas had described. The children had died from poisoning, malnutrition, and medical abuse. Some showed signs of repeated blood draws, evidence of Morrison's obsession with studying their physiological responses. Others showed evidence of broken bones that had healed poorly, suggesting they had been restrained or abused physically as well as medically. Each skeleton told a story of a child who should have lived, who should have grown up, who should have had the chance to become whoever their potential allowed. Instead, they died in service to a man's scientific ambition and a system's need to prove that enslaved people were less than human, a contradiction that required their deaths precisely because they were proving themselves fully, undeniably human. Chapter 8. Descendants and the Weight of Memory. The revelation of the Chapel children's story had profound effects on their descendants and the broader community. For some families, learning the truth about ancestors who had disappeared in the 1850s provided closure. For others, it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. The genealogical work required to connect modern families to the Chapel children took nearly 3 years. Chen's team worked with professional genealogists, DNA analysts, and community historians to trace family lines back through emancipation, through the chaos of the Civil War, through generations of migration and dispersal. The process was complicated by slavery's systematic destruction of family connections. Enslaved people weren't given surnames in many cases, making tracing lineages difficult. Families were separated through sales, and records were often incomplete or destroyed, but genetic analysis, combined with oral histories and plantation records, allowed the team to identify probable descendants for 18 of the 24 children. The notification process was delicate. Chen's team developed protocols for contacting descendants and sharing what they had discovered. Some families already knew pieces of the story through oral tradition. Others had no idea their ancestors had any connection to the chapel. Beverly Matthews, a retired teacher from Jackson, Mississippi, learned in 2022 that she was a descendant of Elizabeth, one of the chapel children who died in July 1854 at age 9. "I knew my family had been enslaved in Wilkinson County," Matthews said, "but the specific details were lost. My grandmother used to say we had an ancestor who was special, who had been taken away for education and never came back. I thought that meant she'd been sold. Learning that she died in medical experiments, that she was 9 years old, that she suffered, it changes everything." Matthews became an advocate for memorializing the chapel children. She worked with Chen's team and local organizations to establish a memorial at the site. The process wasn't easy. Some community members resisted, arguing that memorializing slavery's atrocities was divisive or focused too much on the past. The debate reflected broader tensions in American society about how to remember and teach about slavery. Should the focus be on resistance and resilience, or on the full horror of what was done? Should memorials be somber and grave, or hopeful and forward-looking? Who decides how to remember, descendants, historians, or the broader community? The memorial, ultimately installed at the chapel site in 2024, attempted to balance these considerations. 24 bronze markers, each bearing the name of a child, surround a central monument inscribed with Rachel's words, "We never stopped being human." The design emphasizes the children's humanity while acknowledging their suffering, a way of honoring both who they were and what was done to them. The memorial dedication in May 2024 brought together descendants, historians, and community members. Several descendants spoke, sharing how learning about their ancestors had affected them. Jerome Patterson, descendant of James, spoke about the psychological complexity of discovering this history. Part of me wishes I'd never learned what happened. It's easier to live with vague family stories about ancestors who disappeared than to know the specific details of how a 12-year-old boy was poisoned to death in medical experiments. But ignorance isn't peace, it's just delayed pain. Now I know. Now my children know. Now we can properly honor James's memory by refusing to let his death be meaningless. The educational impact of the Chapel children's story has been significant but contested. Chen's research team developed a curriculum for schools that uses the Chapel program as a case study in how slavery involved not just labor exploitation, but systematic dehumanization through medical experimentation, pseudoscience, and institutional complicity. Several school districts in Mississippi adopted the curriculum. Others rejected it, arguing it was too graphic for students or that it presented an excessively negative view of American history. The debates echoed larger national controversies about critical race theory and how to teach about slavery's legacy. Some African American families whose ancestors were enslaved in Wilkinson County, but not part of the Chapel program, expressed complex feelings about the attention the Chapel children received. All enslaved people suffered, noted James Wilson, a local historian. The Chapel children's suffering was specific and horrifying, but we can't let their story eclipse the millions who suffered in less documented but equally terrible ways. This story matters, but it's one story among millions that deserve to be told. The research also revealed ongoing patterns of institutional failure. Princeton's delayed response to removing Morrison's honors, the initial resistance from some local officials to supporting the excavation, and the continued attempts by some community members to minimize the significance of what happened, all suggested that the same impulses that created the original conspiracy of silence remained active. Chen's final report, published in 2024, addressed this directly. The Chapel children's story is not just historical. It reveals patterns of institutional complicity, willful ignorance, and prioritization of comfort over truth that continue to shape how America processes its slavery legacy. Until these patterns are recognized and challenged, we risk perpetuating the same silences that allowed Morrison's program to continue undetected for nearly a year. The descendants of plantation owners faced particular challenges. Some acknowledged their ancestors' complicity and became active supporters of the memorial. Others struggled with the revelation that their family wealth was built not just on slavery generally, but on this specific atrocity. Amanda Hartwell Stevens, a sixth-generation descendant of Colonel James Hartwell, spoke at the memorial dedication. "I cannot change what my ancestor did. I cannot undo the deaths of 22 children or the trauma inflicted on Rachel and Thomas. But I can refuse to continue the silence. I can ensure that my children know the full truth of where they come from, including the terrible parts. That's the least, the absolute least I owe to these children and their descendants." The financial legacy of the Chapel program also raised difficult questions. The Hartwell plantation generated significant wealth in the 1850s, 1860s, much of which remained in family hands through generations. Some descendants argued that this wealth should be used to support education and healthcare initiatives in African American communities as a form of reparative justice. The Hartwell family established a scholarship fund in 2024 for descendants of enslaved people from Wilkinson County, though debate continues about whether this adequately addresses the historical harm. Chapter 9. Justice Delayed, Memory Preserved. Subscribe to the channel to learn about more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Chapel's 24 children. See you in the next video. 171 years after 24 children were led into a chapel, and only 2 emerged alive. Their story has finally been fully told. But the meaning of that telling remains contested, and the question of justice remains unresolved. Chen's final report, published in April 2024, runs to 847 pages and represents the most comprehensive documentation of medical experimentation on enslaved children ever assembled. It includes Morrison's correspondence, plantation records, Rachel's journal, Thomas's dictated testimony, forensic analysis of the remains, genealogical connections to modern descendants, and contextual analysis of the medical and religious practices of the 1850s. The report forces a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. Morrison wasn't an aberration. He was an extreme version of widespread practices. Medical schools across the South routinely used enslaved people for anatomy instruction and experimental procedures. Plantation owners regularly allowed physicians to conduct experiments on enslaved people. The institutional frameworks that enabled Morrison's program were pervasive throughout the slavery system. The report also documents the conspiracy of silence that hid the program and continued for over 160 years. Every institution involved, plantations, medical societies, churches, county government, academic institutions, chose silence over accountability. And that silence was maintained not just in the 1850s, but through generations that followed. Princeton's reckoning with Morrison's legacy is ongoing. The university commissioned an independent historical review that confirmed Chen's findings and recommended several institutional changes: removal of Morrison's name from all honors, addition of contextual materials to his archived papers, creation of a scholarship fund for descendants of enslaved people, and incorporation of Morrison's story into the university's teaching about its historical connections to slavery. But some Princeton alumni resisted these changes, arguing they judged historical figures by modern standards. This resistance itself demonstrates how thoroughly the mythology around slavery has been sanitized. Morrison murdered children. This isn't a modern moral standard, but a universal human one. The medical profession has also begun confronting this history. The American Medical Association issued a formal acknowledgement in 2023 of the role physicians played in medical experimentation on enslaved people, including programs like Morrison's. The acknowledgement was controversial. Some physicians argued it unfairly maligned the profession, while others noted it didn't go far enough in addressing ongoing racial disparities in healthcare that have roots in this history. Legal questions about the chapel children remained unresolved. Several descendants explored possibilities for lawsuits, seeking damages for what was done to their ancestors. But legal obstacles proved insurmountable. The individuals directly responsible were long dead. Statute of limitations issues barred civil claims, and no clear legal precedent existed for holding institutions liable for atrocities committed 170 years earlier under a legal system that considered enslaved people property rather than persons with rights. This legal dead end frustrated many descendants. "The truth is documented," noted Marcus Johnson. "The crime is proven, the harm is clear, but there's no legal remedy, no way to hold anyone accountable, no compensation for what was stolen from our ancestors. That's not justice, that's just more institutional failure." The memorial at the chapel site has become a place of pilgrimage for some and controversy for others. Over 12 Jerusalem people visited in its first year, including descendants, historians, students, and people drawn by media coverage of the story. The site hosts annual commemorations on May 15th, the date the memorial was dedicated. But the memorial has also been vandalized twice, once with spray paint reading, "Stop digging up the past," and once with more explicitly racist graffiti. These incidents highlight ongoing resistance to fully reckoning with slavery's legacy. Rachel and Thomas, The two survivors, whose testimonies made this research possible, never received recognition during their lifetimes. They lived and died, believing their story would remain buried, but their decision to record what happened, Rachel through her journal, Thomas through his dictations to his daughter, was an act of faith that truth eventually matters. Rachel's final journal entry, written in 1908 when she was 70 years old, reflects on her life and what happened at the chapel. "I am old now. My children are grown. My grandchildren fill my house with joy. I have lived a life Morrison tried to steal from me and succeeded in stealing from the others, but I cannot forget them. Sarah, who taught us to read. Daniel, who remembered everything. Mary, Hannah, James, all of them. They deserved the lives I got to live. They deserved to grow old, to have children, to see grandchildren. They were denied all of this because a man believed we were not fully human, and a system supported that belief. I have kept this journal for 53 years. I do not know if anyone will ever read it. I do not know if the world will ever care about what happened to 24 enslaved children in a Mississippi chapel, but I owe it to them to ensure their story isn't lost entirely. Someone should know what was done. Someone should remember their names. Someone should say, this was wrong. Someone did read it. Someone does care. The world now knows their story. The broader implications of the Chapel children's story extend beyond this specific case. It demonstrates how thoroughly slavery's horrors were hidden, how institutions conspired to maintain silence, and how long truth can remain buried when powerful people prefer comfortable lies. Chen's work has inspired similar investigations at other sites. Researchers are now examining records from other plantation educational programs that may have served similar experimental purposes. Preliminary findings suggest Morrison's program, while extreme, wasn't unique. The full scope of medical experimentation on enslaved people remains undocumented, but the Chapel children's story provides a template for uncovering these buried histories. The story also raises profound questions about historical memory and justice. What do we owe to people who suffered injustices so long ago that no legal remedy exists? How do we memorialize atrocities in ways that honor victims without instrumentalizing their suffering for present political purposes? Who controls historical narratives about slavery? Descendants, academics, institutions, or the broader public?